Good morning and welcome to Bible Truth for Kids. Have you ever been to the Calgary Stampede? You know, it is the world's largest outdoor rodeo. And there is something that happens every day of the week during the Calgary Stampede, and that is free pancake breakfast. They're everywhere. They're free. Look at this one. Look at the crowds that are lined up for free food. And you can get these breakfasts anywhere, you know, in the parking lot of a gas station or a church or a mall, everywhere, and it's free. Does that remind you of another group of people that liked free food? Remember these crowds? Remember that crowd of 5,000 more that Jesus fed? You know, after he had fed them, they were going to force him to become king because they thought, well, if he can do this, make bread for us every day, let's make him king. But Jesus wouldn't let them. And he dismissed those crowds. And some of them went home. Some of them went to other places. And some of them hung around. But the day after that miracle, it was a bit of a mystery because where was Jesus? New boats had come up to Bethsaida. And they gathered there with the crowds that were left over. And they said, like, where is he? He was here yesterday, but we can't find him. And some of them said, well, we know that he had gone up onto the mountain to pray, but like he is nowhere around. Now, if you watched last week's video, you'll remember that this Bethsaida is where Jesus fed the 5,000, and then he had sent his disciples over to the other side to Capernaum. Doesn't look very far, does it? But we know it took a miracle to get there. So the people said, well, we do remember that Jesus sent them over in a boat, but there was only one boat. And so he wouldn't have gone over in a boat. Well, they just couldn't figure it out. So they thought, well, we know that he isn't, the disciples are in Capernaum, so maybe he is there too. But how did he get there? We don't know. Because that miracle was a private one, walking on the water with Jesus, getting to the other side. They didn't know anything about that. But they headed over to Capernaum because they knew that's where the disciples would be. And sure enough, Jesus was there. And the first thing they said to him was like, how did you get here? But Jesus wouldn't tell them because he knew that they were only there for more free food and more miracles. Well, and it was true. They were, because, you know, if they could get Jesus to produce bread every day, their life would be easy. They wouldn't have to do anything. And after all, you know, when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness, they had manna every day. So, you know, they said to Jesus, you know, if you really are the Son of God, make bread rain down from heaven, just like manna came down every day for the Israelites when they were in the wilderness. Now, you know, up to this time, many people have been hearing Jesus teach and seen his powerful miracles. And many people have come to believe that he really is who he says he is, which is the Son of God. But not everybody has thought that. And this crowd was not thinking that. They were thinking of how they could get free bread every day, just like manna in the wilderness. Well, what was manna? And, you know, how and why did that come down every day, like from heaven? Well, in order to understand that, we have to look back into the Old Testament. We have to make another connection. So we're studying John, but we have to go all the way back to Exodus to find out what manna was. And so this is the story. You know, God's people had been in Egypt for 400 years as slaves. And God had said to Moses, lead my people out. I have a brand new promised land to bring them into a beautiful land. And so Moses did. But, you know, once they got over here, you know, they disobeyed God. And as a result, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years before they got to that promised land. And you can kind of see the route that they were taking. But it was about right down here that the story of manna. So what had happened was those Israelites were grumbling yet again against Moses. They came and said to Moses, why did you bring us out here into the wilderness? To starve and die? We would have been better off in Egypt and dying there because, you know, at least we had potfuls of meat and we could stuff ourselves with bread. But out here, there's nothing. Well, The Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for them. Not this kind of bread, though, that we're thinking of, a different kind. But he said, I will also test them and see whether or not they will obey me. So Moses told the people, in the morning there will be bread on the ground. So they went out, but when they went out, what they saw was like a white flaky thing, and kind of like frost, and it covered all of the wilderness. And they said, what is it? You know, manna is the word for what is it? And so this bread that God rained down from heaven every day became called manna. What is it? Well, Moses gave them God's instructions, which were to take enough for everybody in your family, just enough for that day, no leftovers. And you know, it had to be gathered up before the sun came out and melted it. And so they gathered it up, and they either boiled it or baked it. And it tasted like wafers with honey. But you know, one of the instructions was, don't keep any leftovers. But some people, you know, they didn't listen. They thought, well, it's so good, we'll just save some for tomorrow. Well, when the morning came, their manna was full of worms, and it stunk. Moses was angry with them. They did not listen to God. Now, another thing was that manna would be on the ground every day except for the Sabbath, because the Sabbath was a day of rest. And so the day before the Sabbath, they were to gather twice as much. And in the morning on the Sabbath, it wasn't bad, didn't have worms, and it didn't stink. But some people didn't listen. They didn't collect twice as much. And so when they went outside on the Sabbath, nothing. Isn't that amazing? You know, God miraculously provided manna, bread, for his people until they reached the promised land, and then it stopped. And so now the people are saying to Jesus, provide bread for us, just like Moses did in the wilderness. And Jesus said to them, it wasn't Moses that provided bread, provided the manna, it was God. Manna is in the past, and now God the Father has sent me down to you as the true bread of life. Jesus said, I am the bread of life, and whoever comes to me and believes in me will never hunger again. And so they said, well, you know, give us that kind of bread then, so that we don't ever get hungry again. Does that remind you of another story we had? Do you remember the woman at Samaria when Jesus said to her, I can give you living water so that you'll never thirst again? And she had said, give me that water. Well, what Jesus is doing is he's giving us a pitcher with bread and with water to tell us that he is the only source of satisfaction inside. He is the only one that can give us peace and joy and satisfy those longings that we have. So that kind of bread, this kind of bread, he said, you know, that's only going to last for a while, but what I give you will always satisfy you. Well, some of the people looked around and they said, is he going to give us bread or not? Because if he's not going to give us bread, we're not going to hang around. And you know, they didn't. They left. Well, next week we are going to see how Jesus really does feed us. And you know, we're going to find out the answer to that is going to cause a lot of anger, some confusion, and problems. But we are also going to see that some people believe it, and they have really come to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. See you next time.